Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Recently, we've been talking a lot about certain categories that are often described as having an inherent politics. You might want to think about this with in regards to our recent episode on the politics of queerness. But really, it's kind of inaccurate to say that certain things, certain categories, certain notions, certain bodies have an inherent politics, so much as they can be inherently politicized. And it's indeed people who must politicize them, who must make arguments for their cases, who must advance political movements in the struggle to liberate it beyond the simple inherent politics, which has to be carried out rather than simply carried through. And to discuss this, we are joined by, returning to the show actually, Juliana Gleeson to discuss her new book, Hermaphrodite Logic, A History of Intersex Liberation. Jules, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back. Hi.
So just to start off with, one of the things I really love about this book is it's kind of a history of political argumentation as at the forefront of political movements, and indeed a history of reason. When you say it's reason as, quote, an ongoing challenge to the command of clinical reason. I just wanted to ask, what does it mean to write this kind of history?
That's a very good question. I think more than anything, what I set out to do with Hermaphrodite Logic was to tell a much briefer, a much more truncated history than ones which had previously been told. So, like you say, and in your quote you just read out, the narrative I'm following is mostly a challenge to clinical reason. And specifically, it's a challenge which is mounted over a very short window of time. So the time frame I'm really following in the book runs from 1990 to the present day. So a span of around 35 years. And that's sort of mostly what the book's narrative focuses. And it begins even more recently than that in 96 for the first few pages of the narrative account. So yeah, the book's very much focused on the tail end of 20th century counterculture. And the reason why I strictly limited the span of it that way hopefully becomes clear in the course of telling my narrative. But to make it very succinct, the thing I'm trying to do is look at exactly the moment that a political challenge was mounted against the previous governing processes which intersex people, and especially intersex infants, were running through.
And one of the ways in which this narrative unfolds is through the notion you bring up in the beginning of the book, which is the idea of the expressive character of sex as a category and as a lived reality, but not in the sense that sex is self-expressive, but it has to be asserted by a political and indeed often a rational agent. I was wondering if we could unpack this idea of the expressiveness of sex as you describe it.
I don't really believe in unpacking. I do believe in provocation. So starting off the book by saying that sex is expressive, starting off the book with the framing of an awakening, and even including the word hermaphrodite in the title. These are all provocative moves, and they're all ones which I'm prepared to stand by. The reason I use the word expressive specifically is sort of meant to be its own sort of counterpoint, its own little point of struggle with the existing sort of mores or the existing conventions of theory, which actually proliferate out of the year 1990 as much as anything else. So like this kind of deconstructive moment in theory. But there's a reason which I say that sex is expressive. There's a reason that I use the word hermaphrodite, and there's a reason I have this line also in the introduction. I say, but in the 1990s, an awakening took place. The world was forced to come to terms with intersex people, not only as flesh to be managed, but as humans, those who offer reasons and respond to them. So not only as flesh to be managed, but as humans, those who offer reasons and respond to them. And I feel like, and the next line is, as one early movement VHS tape had it, Hermaphrodites Speak. So that's the title of the VHS tape, Hermaphrodites Speak. So my ambition with this book was both to provide some kind of new provocation, but also to familiarize the reader with this peculiar political movement with intersex liberation, which sprung out of the particular conditions of the last decade of the 20th century with the 1990s. And in those movement writings, you can find this term hermaphrodite and this term awakening quite liberally used. So those sort of terms spring up all over the place. And I'm interested in sort of capturing the texture of that movement writing, of that rhetoric, and especially the style that they adopted in mounting this kind of challenge. So I want people both to be aware of the arguments they were making and also hopefully to kind of follow the style and the means which they were using to mount these arguments. And that's where expressiveness really comes in.
Hmm. And particularly one of the things I find was really fascinating was the use of style as a political vector, but also as a rational vector. It isn't simply rhetoric, and it gets sort of the way that I guess if people spend too much time with Plato, they think that all rhetoric is simply a knack rather than a techne, rather than a craft. And one of the ways in which this really comes through actually is the way in which the earlier intersex advocates in Boston in the 1990s really tried to quite sardonically reverse the position of medical power when it relates to intersex bodies when it comes to the correction, quote unquote, or as he rightfully called it, cutting of intersex bodies for a corrective kind of measure. Again, quote unquote corrective. We have to be Foucauldian when we say corrective. They're quite there. I just wanted to ask actually, we can unpack particularly some of exactly this historical aspect of the history you recount from the original Boston protests with the term Hermaphrodites Speak, or more accurately, Hermaphrodites with attitude in that particular protest.
Oh, sure. So like you say, Hermaphrodite Speak was the title of this VHS tape which they put out, which they recorded in the summer of '96. So a few months before this opening protest, they pulled off in Boston, in Massachusetts. And yeah, and at this protest in Boston, which is where my narrative account starts, in the autumn of '96, this group, the Intersex Society of North America, or ISNA, two of their members take to the streets to run this protest of a convention of pediatricians, so of physicians focusing on the health of children. So they staged this protest to try and contest and challenge and picket, actually, this gathering, the AAP gathering. So that stands for the American Academy of Pediatrics. So the protesters are having sort of gathered in consciousness raising groups, including the group that was filmed in this VHS tape I referenced, Hermaphrodites Speak. They then take to the streets and use this sort of identifier, Hermaphrodites with attitude, that had also been the name of that in-house magazine, which I include a picture from in the book. So the sort of back and forth which I'm tracing runs from 1990 to '96. And up until that point, up until this street demonstration, this kind of confrontation of intersex people, former patients of some of the doctors they are now picketing. Prior to that point, you have this pretty fascinating back and forth that unfolds basically as soon as academic feminists, so scholars specifically with natural science training, clinical psychologists in one case, Susanna Kessler, and in another case, a research biologist, and Fausto Starling. So as soon as this handful of critical science scholars start to publish their work, both in in-house feminist magazines, which some of your listeners may still know today, like Science, and also in natural science magazines with a kind of critical purview, such as the Sciences, which is where Anne Fausto Starling publishes her famous essay, The Five Sexes. As soon as these feminist scholars start to actually have a research output, they begin to immediately be emailed by one ISNA activist by the name of Beau Laurent, far better known as Cheryl Chase, which is their movement name. And they receive these emails and are sort of brought into dialogue with, at first, quite a small number of intersex people, and then more and more of them as an editorial letter by Beau under the name of Cheryl Chase is published in the Sciences as a sort of response to the Five Sexes essay by Anne Fausto Starling. And weirdly enough, this is actually the place that ISNA's foundation is announced. So in the back pages of a natural scientific research journal. So this sort of like sets the tone for the early years of ISNA. So ISNA is exceptionally overeducated, highly sardonic, has this kind of mordant wit, this kind of dark gallows humor by those who are coming to terms with having been hanged, I suppose, to stretch the metaphor. And as well as this kind of sardonic dark wit, Isner displays a considerable fluency with the existing terms of art that are used in the processes that are used to sort of discipline and corral anomalous sex. So this is how, by the time they even take to the streets in 96, you also have this really deep and this really powerful form of self-conscious understanding, which these groups have adopted. So more than anything, Hermaphrodite Logic is sort of an attempt to absorb and in some ways even imitate this early style. And that's the reason that I sort of provocatively picked this term hermaphrodites to appear in the title. But one thing I should mention at this point is that most of the people we're talking about, so I follow the cases of Max Beck and Morgan Holmes for the first chapter, but then continuing into the 2000s, most of the people we're talking about, the people who are actually drawn into this kind of activism, have been diagnosed at one point or another in their life as pseudo-hermaphrodites. So pseudo-hermaphroditism is this governing concept following on from earlier terms like spurious hermaphroditism. And all variations on this term are basically trying to indicate that there are the occasional, extremely rare, true hermaphrodite that will have half each or maybe even two operative sets of gonads secreting various different sex hormones. But more often you'll have humans which are actually a facade form. So they may appear to be a male or female on the surface, but a skilled examiner is then able to dig down, in some cases quite literally, using tissue sectioning. And then a skilled observer, a clinical observer, is able to determine the true form of their sex. So this is sort of what the intersex people of the later 20th century had found themselves up against. And this is what appeals to hermaphroditism. We're both sort of supposed to pastiche and also supposed to undermine.
After reading the introduction, I was really struck by your mention of the use of things like sardonic wit, caustic humor, and so forth as not only defining of the emotional tonality of the intersex movement, but as a sort of strategy as well. And I just want to read out the one paragraph that I'm referring to, and then I have a question related to that. While focused on the needs of a small minority, the intersex movement has presented a range of arguments of universal concern. Anyone fighting for liberation can learn from both the campaign's victories and the limits of the approach taken by the intersex movement. Some hostile clinicians have been quick to cast the intersex movement as a group of excessively passionate and extremism-driven zealots. But the movement tends to show a more sardonic and conciliatory face. Intersex liberation writings include everything from gallows humor, cartoons, to exhaustive reports for NGOs. Both registers strive for a kind of coldness that belies the passionate involvement of these advocates. Instead of relying on pathos, intersex movement writings have tended towards quieting obvious reactions and sublimating traumas into displays of wit, meticulousness, and sang-froid. And pardon my French there at the end. But when I first read the introduction, I was hesitant to create a question around this, even though I had a profound curiosity. But then I notice you repeat this gesture throughout the book, talking about, as you said, the use of humor and wit and so forth as a leverage point against opposition to intersex movements. And I was just curious, more broadly, what do you think the role and how is it that something like humor is so effective, or perhaps even more effective than other sort of reactive forms of critique, let's say, or other kinds of moral posturing? Because one thing that we're up against clearly, or we have been up against over the past 5 to 10 years in the world of this struggle, not just LGBTQ, but also the intersex movement specifically here, is how do we deal with the charge that activists are stodgy, moralistic, and so forth, where you have something like humor, you have this leverage, but it runs the risk of becoming reactionary in a sense. Reactionaries are the ones who often identify with this claim that we just need to be more fun about things. We need to have a humorous attitude towards things like gender. But of course, it's often a way to reclaim a caricature of whether it's gender or sex, and then, of course, leverage that, in order to buttress reactionary views. But within the disparity in activist movements, maybe not even just in the realm of gender and sex, but just broadly construed, do you think there is, an effectivity Or is there a better reason for us to be using things like humor as a way to fight the opposition? And I'll just say one last thing before you answer that question. Like, the one thing that I've seen clearly on social media, especially amongst young trans folks in particular, is the use of humor not only within their communities, but amongst allies and advocates to kind of create a sense of solidarity that's there. So I was hoping that you could just respond to that massive bundle of questions I put forward.
I think that's a great bundle of questions. I don't really feel qualified to offer any strategic goalposts or to speak on behalf of young trans people or anything like that. But I feel like for monogot readers, use this term sang-froid that I deploy in the book, which just means cold-bloodedness. And another word for what I'm getting at here is numbness or non-responsiveness, even insensitivity, which is both a physiological term of art and also a style. And I think the reason there's a the reason, getting to the logic bit of hermaphrodite logic for a moment, the reason it's adopted is partly out of necessity. It's partly because of the condition people were left in by the treatments of their intersex variations. So as I said in opening, like it's gallows humor, coming to terms with having been hanged. But what I mean is a lot of the advocates at this point are addressing medical mistreatment, whether that's neglect, which almost any intersex person tends to have been through, or something more active in the case of those who are identifiably anatomically intersex at birth. So we're talking about genital cutting, gonadectomies, other procedures like that. So disproportionately, the early intersex advocates had been through one or both of those things. For that reason, a certain degree of like numbed up non-responsiveness was simply the place that they found themselves in and what they were trying to describe to outsiders. But there was also a strategic effect, which this quote from Morgan Holmes I get into in the course of chapter 1. And this is actually specifically the fallout and split within ISNA that happens even as soon as they have their first protest, with Morgan Holmes leaving the group seemingly as early as that point in 96, at least by her own account. The reasoning that she gives and the thing that Morgan Holmes is trying to convey in that quote I include from the book is just that people are not really put into a useful state by shock tactics, by appeals to pity and to sympathy, and that, put simply, a lot of the surface level reactions people get once familiarizing themselves by this topic, the sort of horror and the dismay that you tend to come to expect when you're just sort of like outlining or sketching what happens to identifiably intersex people from birth, that these just aren't really conducive, helpful states to some kind of political struggle that then transforms those circumstances for future generations, which is really the overriding interest of intersex advocacy as soon as these consciousness raising groups start to establish themselves. So at the start of my answer, I sort of like gestured towards the plurality of different experiences that intersex variations cause people to have. So some people have medical neglect, which runs for years and decades, and others have a kind of excess of medical focus and concern and are treated basically like an emergency by quirk of their birth. And the reason that intersex surgeries become such a focal point for campaigning is that any gathering of intersex people, of course, has to process this sort of variation and this diversity of experiences. And of course, those who've been through the worst treatment have experienced a kind of indignity and a horror which becomes a focus point for all intersex campaigning, because it simply can't be allowed to stand that these removal of gonads, excision of tissues in ways which would otherwise be classified as a form of genital mutilation, legally speaking. That's the reason that this becomes like the overriding focus for intersex campaigning. So in light of that, I think the intersex movement is mostly kind of geared around various strategies to try and halt the very worst of medical practice or mispractice as it's applied to intersex people. And yeah, like I said, it's simply the judgment of a lot of people involved that the best way to do that is some version of some version of advocacy which uses displays of fluency and reasoned judicious address, and I guess especially which kind of like exceeds the understanding provided by clinical practitioners, which is crossing a low bar necessarily. But as things continue, that advocacy either focuses on established bodies for clinical practice and care. So that's why this very first protest in '96 starts outside the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics in Boston, or else it moves into focusing on human rights bodies or basic rights in the case of the European Union, or other kind of larger global governance level consortiums, and especially like LGBT versions F. So whatever the platform or whatever the kind of like political tier that's applied to, there's this consistent need for rhetoric and understandings which don't sort of resort to the lowest common denominator, or sort of like, yeah, kind of like any sort of rhetoric which is simply going to drop people into a reactive and sort of emotionally charged state. And that's the consistent thread for intersex advocates, whatever else they seem to have disagreed about. So basically like holding themselves to quite a high standard, and in all sorts of different ways, sort of displaying a competency and a fluency which probably exceeds the treatment that they were coming to expect from supposed professionals or relevant expert authorities.
Yeah, and one of the things I actually want to pick up on actually was you mentioned sort of, the rhetorical style tries to avoid simply focusing on a kind of a moral appeal to a kind of clinical pity. And I think one of the ways that your book sort of demonstrates how this counter rhetoric from intersex advocates played out was by pointing out that actually, our emotional states, our mental states, our bodies aren't quite being so much medicalized in so much as the feelings and anxieties of the parents and the medical professionals themselves are being medicalized, and saying that because our parents are worried that we might not fit in, or doctors are worried about later in life fitting into like basically norms of sexual practice and social reproduction, that is the reason that the surgical intervention and the medical intervention gets imposed on their bodies, almost as if, there's a brilliant quote from chapter 2 when you talk about how in response to intersex advocacy, they don't so much change the practices as much as they aim to more change the categories by dividing them into moving from pseudo hermaphroditism to this plethora of quote unquote disorders of sexual development, in which case it becomes redefined purely as disorder. And you say that the three and newly acknowledged sexes were male, female, and chaos. So I just wanted to ask a bit more about this aspect, particularly when it comes to the conference in Chicago that happens later, of how the medical profession tries to, re-legitimate itself in the face of intersex advocacy.
Yeah, male, female, chaos. That's one of my spicy lines in this book. I think this resolution or attempted resolution of anxieties, which the earliest intersex advocates are addressing, I think that's actually an argument which takes us right back to 1990s. So Susanna Kessler's essay in Signs tries to capture two things. And one is the lockstep orthodoxy. She uses this term orthodoxy for the kind of loyal adherence that medics by this stage exhibit towards the protocols set down by John Money in the post-war period. Listeners who are sort of familiar with the history of sex as a concept and its development will be all too familiar with John Money. But what Kessler's trying to do in this essay, especially, is to see if there's any differentiation between male and female clinicians. So she studies for female medics and for male ones, and of course, intersex ones. And Kessler's conclusion is that there really isn't any difference. Like, the female clinicians exhibit just as much horror around clitorises that are deemed to be excessively large. And in this essay, The Medical Construction of Gender, Case Management of Intersexed Infants, Kessler talks about how firstly, that there's an orthodoxy that they're all loyally following, but secondly, privately and between each other, and increasingly to Kessler as her field work through the later 1980s continues, they will exhibit this sort of like obvious horror and dismay that they have all of these different protocols for measurements, levels of hormones, acceptable clitoral lengths, and so on. And yet they would ultimately just come down to sort of eyeballing and guessing the fates of these children. So just to give you a very obvious example, many infants are born with a urethral slit, which doesn't like appear at the tip of their penis. Instead, it appears somewhere along the base. So this is called a hypospadias. And in these cases, for all of the measurements and all of the complex things in place, they would simply sort of examine where this hole appeared, and then try and guesstimate how many difficulties the infant in question would then have peeing standing up 4 to 5 years' time when they started doing so at kindergartens and then middle school. So this would sort of be the actual operative basis for whether any surgical procedure took place. So that just gives you a glimpse at the kind of like guesstimation and speculation that medics would sort of begin to apply. So Kessler uses the term heterosexism, which is still in use today, to sort of apply to the many edge cases, or the fuzzy cases which would appear in this instance. So obviously the surgeons and also the overall clinical teams are sort of roughly trying to evaluate, is this person going to have a viable phallus for penetrating the spouse, which we assume is going to be a wife, which they marry? Is this person going to have a penetrable vagina to be penetrated by her future husband? Like these are the basic like heterosexism like equations that these clinical teams are trying to run in their head. And of course, this both dismays them, but also they don't sort of have a way out of it. So the kind of sinister aspect which Kessler then tries to sketch is a process which can only really be described as grooming, but grooming not of the children, but grooming of parents. So parents are then given selective bits of information. They're given euphemisms and shock tactics by time to sort of put them into this sort of reactive state, which makes them pliable for clinicians to lead them down the path towards surgical outcomes if required. So that's the study which is being put together in this essay, The Medical Construction of Gender, Case Management of Intersex Infants in 1990. And that's the basic story which the intersex movement spreads out to the world come 1996. And specifically, what Max Beck, one of these two activists, says is that their anatomies, their physiologies, intersex people's bodies are being framed as the source of emergency and potential psychological breakdowns should these intersex children not be socialized and surgically treated in the correct way to match that socialization. But in reality, these surgeries, operations, all of this medical neglect is running to kind of try and smooth over, and I use this term known over throughout the book, it's seeking to like know over these intersex bodies in ways which are sort of palatable for broader society. And that begins with the clinicians treating them, and it begins with the parents taking them home. So that's the argument in the 1990s. And then when I get to the second chapter of the book, I'm going to try and get through this one a bit more briefly because you've summarized it really well. Specifically, the word disorder is sort of happened upon in what I call like the burial of the pseudo-hermaphrodite. So the pseudo-hermaphrodite has to be like expunged very visibly. They have to shed these tongues and they have to get rid of it. And in a way, this is actually supported and endorsed by certain key figures in the leadership of ISNA, not all of whom are themselves intersex, but in combination with ISNA's rather eccentric leadership, the medical profession decides to hit upon this term DSD, so disorders of sex development, in order to effect this burial of pseudo-hermaphroditism. So previously in John Money's publications or German sexology, which still uses more of these terms, there's this notion of like hermaphroditism in humans. So they will establish there is hermaphroditism in humans, and then they say in the first sentence or paragraph of these things, of course, these aren't real hermaphrodites. They're not sequential hermaphrodites that breed as males one season and females the next. They're not true hermaphrodites that have two sets of reproductive organs. So really, there's these pseudo-hermaphrodites in almost every instance, and we've got to figure out what type of pseudo-hermaphrodite we're dealing with, male or female. So that's sort of like the norm of post-war sexology. But what shifts in 2005 in this so-called Chicago consensus document, which you referenced, is a group of European and American, mostly US American, physicians get together, and this term DSD is introduced. But specifically, DSD still includes what one of the scholarly essays I include in the book refers to as sex coding. And sex coding is basically the continuation of that case management that Kessler was examining. So again, among mixed company, among parents in front of journalists or anything like that, medical professionals will say that DSD stands for differences of sex development, whereas in their in-house publications, privately, one MD to another qualified MD, they will say actually DSD stands for disorders of sex development. So what is being retained here is not just the sense of male, female, and chaos, but also the sense of professional authority and expert qualification, MD to MD, in a kind of differentiated form. So there's differences in mixed crowds, and then you have the sort of like in peer-reviewed pediatrics journals, they will literally say the more politically correct term is differences, but what this really means is disorders. So that's what doctors are sort of trying to retain as best they can come the early 20th century. But the reason that there is a challenge and the reason that there is a crisis is exactly this spillage of fluency which has happened through the ascendancy of the tech industry, through critical feminist research, and more than anything, through political struggle, through people showing up outside their own conferences and picketing and so on from the intersex movement themselves. Of course, you'll never expect clinical professionals to actually tell you that this is the challenge they're up against. So they come up with other sort of conceptual explanations for why they're doing all of this burying of pseudo-hermaphroditism. But hopefully, in the course of this book, I show you that this is really the agonistic moment, the moment of struggle, which medical professionals had found themselves in by the end of the century and through to the present day.
It's clinical correctness gone mad, as a sardonic approach might take it.
So this raises a curiosity that I've long had, and we're edging up against it right here, which is, what does the sort of activist to clinic pipeline look like in terms of destituting the logic of the clinic as it has been traditionally, where in the case of so-called pseudo-hermaphroditism, that the category of binary sex tends to be reinserted at any given decade in the past, let's say, century or more. What strides have been made in sort of very transparent and noticeable ways in comparison to, let's say, the 1990s, and how has the activism impacted the way that the clinic handles such cases?
Sorry, I can't quite. Do you mean in a given place or what?
I think what I'm asking is amongst the intersex movement, there's going to be a certain set of experiences, a certain kind of rhetoric that develops and so forth. And it may be the liberation movement in some sense is outstripping what's happening at the clinic, but maybe not. So that's the question that I'm asking. What is the dialectic between the movement and the clinic look like? And how does one inform the other in terms of improving the ways that we deal with such challenges?
Can I suggest a country? Can we say Germany? My next question was going to be about Germany, so I just want to throw that in, because I think with Germany, I think one of the things that really horrified me when I was reading it in this book is how the reassertion of the fact the clinic reasserted itself against intersex liberation by reasserting the family as a kind of private ownership over children, and as it's kind of grooming them to think about this, it becomes a private family matter, you know.
Okay. That's the story I'm telling. That's the story I'm telling in the 2000s chapters onwards, which is both American clinicians, like in their own publications, and then this remarkable group of like advocates for the parents of intersex people in Germany have this sort of shared argument they come out with from the early 2000s onwards, that there's just no case for legal bans on procedures on intersex children that would then infringe, by extension, on all kinds of other expressions of parental authority. So in Germany, there's this term family privacy. And specifically in the book, I look at this one philosopher, Alan Fieder's close reading of the arguments found around family privacy that were put out by this German group, which, to be clear, Fieder is opposed to. And so the argument at this point is, since the clinical establishment is kind of experiencing a breakdown of that overall authority and this idea that they can sort of correctly judge the true sex of children and prevent horrifying outcomes, especially around the becoming lesbians or becoming trans later on in their lives, as that breakdown happens in the 2000s, you see both in their in-house publications and this German political the Heinz output, that they're mostly using these appeals to basically, like, if parental authority breaks down here, then why would it hold other places? You can see a weird echo of this in more recent legislation around trans teenagers, although it's rather more inconsistent. So, as many of my listeners will be aware, the local and now the federal level bans that are being put in place across the United States around teenage transitioners have usually included explicit exemptions to ensure that intersex surgeries or intersex procedures or hormonal treatment of intersex pubescents, that all of these things are still legally sanctioned and allowed to continue. You can also see the same with federal bans in Russia, although there the justification for outlawing transition, medically speaking, was a bit more sweeping and more to do with the war effort against Ukraine. So both in this Russian federal ban and across the United States, you can see bans on teen transition, which explicitly have to say that intersex procedures are not covered because in many instances there just isn't a medical difference to what's taking place, in the same way that similar bans against FGM introduced by liberal feminists in the United States on the federal level and elsewhere would also have to include kind of explicit exemptions to say that they were not including cases such as congenital adrenal hyperplasia in the case of XX children, or complete androgen sensitivity syndrome case, insofar as people with CASE or people with CAH can still have clitoral cutting, so-called resections, or gonadectomies in the cases of CASE. So basically what we see in all these different legal instances is there's a need to either differentiate intersex people enough, or an argument that intersex people are just not differentiated sufficiently to be legally protected. So from the 2000s through to the present day, especially in kind of legal instances, you see a lot of sort of like retrenchment and efforts that either seek to sort of wall off intersex people from the supposed protections which are being introduced around teen transitions, alternatively to say that they aren't differentiated, or even that they aren't. So this is the final thing which Elizabeth Rice gets into in her new version of her American History of Intersex. So in many cases, what is used by people trying to keep these surgeries and other interventions legal is they'll often say that intersex is an incoherent category, so that there isn't an intersex, there isn't an exhaustive list of what makes someone intersex, but there isn't an intersex community in any coherent sense. And for that reason, legal protections are sort of impossible to introduce. And specifically, they often will try and, at this point, like wall off one intersex variation from the rest of them. So especially congenital adrenal hyperplasia is seen as something which can be sort of like excluded from either intersex variations, but increasingly also so-called differences of sex development or disorders of sex development, DSDs. Increasingly, it's argued that actually CAH is not either one of these. So there's all kinds of like conceptual trickery and sort of legalistic footwork which gets used to either show that intersex people aren't special enough, they aren't specific enough, so they can't be protected, or that they are so distinctive and so specific that they can't receive overall protections. And if you want like an extreme case of this, I believe the legislation in Alabama, I actually haven't kept track of whether they even brought this one through, but this draft legislation in Alabama specifically says intersex surgery is fine, male circumcisions are fine, teenage transitioners are not. So in all things, you sort of just have to turn to the reactionaries and to the right wing for a sort of a quick index of what moves are taken to be stabilizing or soothing of sex versus the ones which are taken to be disruptive of it. So,
and something I actually want to bring up just conceptually about sort of in the logic of these various legal approaches and bills is that in saying this, it feels like there's a contradiction where they affirm kind of the plasticity of the body in that sense. And like, I mean, you mentioned in the book that one of the clinical ideology of the American Association of Pediatricians is that, psychology and medicine are there to shape the plasticity of the infantile body in such a way that it can adapt to society. I guess it feels a little bit Freudian to that extent, although Freud was surprisingly good. If you read his free essays on the theory of sexuality, on why actually the basic human bisexuality is not based on a kind of biological hermaphroditism. But more in the sense of turning what they consider to be unbearable future misery into common future unhappiness. And there was a recent book by Jules Steele Peterson called History of the Transgender Child that really takes aim at this concept of plasticity as something that has been abused or is maybe central to the kind of medical neglect and abuse of not only trans children, but possibly also intersex children as well. And I wanted to ask actually about this concept of plasticity, like how much work you think it's doing in these kinds of legal debates or the kind of legal shiftiness of the medical apparatus here. And do you think it's a good rubric to think about going forward? Because I guess when it comes to considering, things as plastic, we also think of them as mutable, and transition in ways does demonstrate the mutability of fixed categories. But then also on the other side, the immutability here, or sorry, the mutability is that which is being kind of exploited as a resource to push intersex people into these normalized sex categories. It's just something a debate I was interested in kind of this general literature that's now forming.
I think it's just in the nature of this book that there's a lot of there's a lot of antagonism it exhibits towards existing work on this topic, which is left kind of latent or implicit to it, rather than being something I necessarily need to like thrash out or explicate. And I think more than anything, what I liked about writing this book this way and what I like about leading professionalized academia is that I hope my method is clear enough to people who read it, but methodology is not something I really need to explicate or have like a whole lit review about before we get into the story. And really, I was quite determined to drop this whole thing, to kind of drop the reader in media res, to sort of like immerse people in the intersex struggle rather than introduce them to it. And I'm pretty satisfied that that's something I've been able to do. I guess like it's kind of like, because the reader's supposed to be dropped into it, and then they sort of just have to trust me that I'm not going to lead them to drown. And that's especially because of the style of the first chapter, which has this sort of non-sequential through line. It's supposed to read a little bit like Pulp Fiction, basically. And that's only one of several 90s references from The Matrix to Cronenberg in this chapter title, Sex in the Wreckage. That's the final. Sex in the Wreckage is the more philosophical chapter after the history's finished. So there's like a peppering of 90s references, which again is supposed to get you into the texture of things. And I hope is more satisfying than a methodology chapter. But since I'm chatting with Acid Horizon, we can talk a bit of it. So one of the things I want to do with the book, if I was going to explicate its methodology, is the reader in the know reader is supposed to be unclear by the end of it of my affiliation when it comes to Foucault. I do sort of toy around with this reliance on explicit references to Foucault, which happens all across the debate in the 2000s. So the debate in the 2000s is mostly between different academic feminists. So of course they're all sort of making reference to Foucault sort of as a matter of like, I guess, successive Oedipal loyalty following on from John Money in a way. So the medical humanities just trains you to care about Foucault and be dismayed, but most MDs don't really care or even switch off their brains as soon as mention to him happens. And yeah, I was fascinated with this kind of irony about both sides of the introduction of DSDs within the intersex movement. So people bitterly opposed to it and people who are actually pushing the idea forward. I was sort of very entertained with this irony that both sides are actually making extensive references to him in their publications. So I think that's a reason to reason to drop it as an orthodoxy. There's a reason to believe that if both sides of that debate were sort of framing this as like a fidelity to his legacy, that we should just sort of give it an ironic laugh and move on. But then yeah, by the end of this, but then of course, like in this, especially like this chapter of Struggle Without a Center, my own historical account is about nothing other than centralization. So yeah, specifically the introduction of these so-called centers for excellence as the institutional underpinnings of this new category, DSD, and centers for excellence are sort of these multidisciplinary teams. So the idea is you can have a whole crowd of MDs sort of applied to each intersex emergency of birth and hopefully produce a good outcome. So that's obviously another way of like retrenching clinical authority. But of course, centers for excellence are something which are then mapped around the imperial cause. So it's a lot harder to run one in Botswana or in Ghana than in the Netherlands or the East Coast of the United States. So that sort of narrative of centralization is definitely one which I'm sort of playing with. And I guess in a way it's like, yeah, how far that's following Foucault's method is really a matter for discussion, and also not a discussion I'm especially interested in. So it's kind of left to the reader to decide. But as for Jules Gold-Peterson, I mean, the question with Jules Gold-Peterson is just why that book was called Histories of the Transgender Child rather than Histories of the Intersex and Transgender Child, when much of the narrative was sort of like addressing exactly a back and forth between those two things. And I think the treatment of plasticity that happens in that book, I don't think it's really like informative on plasticity in the term that I'm using here. And especially the one I'm getting into is Catherine Malibu's point around the time is exactly that. Yeah, Catherine Malibu's like sense of it is meant to include both this fact that there is a malleability and a flexibility, but then more difficulty around resetting that occurs with plastic, and also the sort of like explosive potential. And I think without needing to have any explicit or willful fidelity to her, there's more the sense of plasticity, which is appearing in the course of this book's narrative. So both a malleability that occurs with the first impact, with the first sort of expressive moment of heterosexism, and the sort of guesstimation of infant and early childhood genitals, which medical professionals are attempting to do, followed up by much more difficulty with further resetting in the face of numbed out scar tissue, harder to cut through, harder to feel with, and so on. But also the explosive motion that follows these heterosexist expressive like assertions. So in a way, the intersex movement's history is one of kickback, and indeed an explosive one, which begins, as I say, with two people in Boston, but then ends with a global movement that's running on a back and forth line. And the thing we haven't really got into in the discussion so far is by the end of the historical account, the narrative that I'm sketching out is the global South, so to be more specific, Latin America and African intersex organizations are actually playing a strategic leading role in the successful activism that occurs across the United States, especially in Chicago and New York State. So the Intersex Justice Project is one group which I follow for a moment, which is exactly trying to apply these localized versions of successful struggles that have been winning out in Africa, Asia, and sort of also in the margins of Europe. So in countries like Malta, like Greece, and like Portugal. So sort of like even within Europe, the bits of Europe which are ambiguously part of the imperialist core. So yeah, like that's the sort of like explosive moment that this book's trying to follow. And I think that's the sense of plasticity as like a double entendre, which I'm adhering to. But yeah, just to reiterate, I think it's part of the fun of being ex-academic that you don't really have to like fully justify or nail your colors to the mast. You can sort of like you can just apply your method and see. You can allow the people who care about these things to sort of unpick it and interpret it to their own amusement without really having to like bog down readers who just want to get into the immersion itself.
No, I completely understand. I mean, I think this is highlighted very well towards the end of the book when you mentioned how much of this is read through the 50 Shades of Foucault. But I really want to pick up, particularly as he's talking about the colonial aspect of intersex liberation, or rather the colonial pushback to intersex liberation. Particularly when you talk about the case of South Africa, which is really in many ways, it seems to be, history, quite a pioneer of these rights. And it also has a linkage to race science, essentially, where race scientists, quote unquote, race scientists in South Africa were saying that African people had a predisposition towards, quote unquote, hermaphroditism. And one of the ways that actually came to the forefront, at least in terms of the global, and by global we mean determined by the Western, global North hegemony here, is when it comes to one of the real antagonists of this book, which is the World Athletics Association. And it was just when they were talking about how, actually parts in the global South don't have as many of these surgeries because they're not so developed. And therefore, at this point when the West is trying to do prenatal screening to like preempt the existence of an intersex child, which can't help but feel a little bit like the scientific quote unquote search for a quote unquote gay gene, which one can screen out sort of Gattaca style, and it's inherently eugenic. I was wondering if you could talk actually about particularly the struggle in South Africa as one example of this colonial relation, because one of the things that you really hit on, I'm just going to quote you here actually, and says you say, in this account of sex and civilization, a tidy and unmistakable split between male and female is the prerequisite for entry into civilized life. If childbirth and rearing outside of the imperialist core features less intersex genital cutting, this is surely a sign of the region's relative backwardness. Confusingly for these accounts, traditional female genital cutting practices are also taken as an indication of primitive inferiority. And so this really puts people in a double bind here, and also imposed on partaking in the spectacle, which is the Olympics, which we saw with the case of Caster Semenya and, of course, Iman Khalif in the last Olympics.
Yeah, I think that quote you just read out for me, that there is really there's this antinomy, there's this dissonance, because people are incapable of understanding female genital cutting without this kind of recourse to it being rural African, animist backwardness. Like that is so central to popular understanding of it, that either any theoretical, critical approaches to it of the kind we've read so much from Black feminists, or any kind of empirical work. So basically, like, female genital cutting is still widely practiced in Indonesia and is still widely practiced in urban areas there. And yeah, despite kind of efforts to ban it on the level of global governance bodies. But yeah, I think it just does indicate how there's this need for a shorthand of like female genital cutting as the primitive aspect that even survives these statements by sporting bodies about economic development. So somehow intersex infants and children having escaped this surgery is a sign of backwardness, just as female genital cutting is at the same time. And again, this is something which intersex activists have addressed as far back as the 2000s and early versions of the vagina monologues, which sort of also allowed this same kind of like dialectic of backwardness to play out in the varied ways in which they treated these different, clearly overlapping topics. So in the way that I address African intersex struggles, the key thing I'm trying to convey in the book is how a lot of times this kind of question of like athletes and specifically the admixture of racism and interphobia, which happens around African athletes, has become central to popular understandings of intersex. So that's happened from the 2000s in the case of Caster Semenya. And in the preface, I also describe the Donald Trump's campaign's use of Imane Khalif in his most recent, very successful run for re-election. So despite having no direct authority over it, Trump made this a sort of really central concern, this idea that like male and female athletes, by which he mostly meant these African intersex Olympians, that there would be like a lockdown on that once he was elected president, which of course he was, kind of in this blow-up victory, winning every single so-called swing state. So first of all, in the book, I wanted to convey how this had become like one of the primary ways which people understand this topic, and especially follow this figure of Caster Semenya, who serves as kind of like really laconic counterpoint. In my chapter addressing this, it sort of starts off with this quote from her where she says, "I am a woman and I am vast." And that's sort of her total like straightforward through line against all of this speculation and kind of like controversy that's cast around her. But also, I think it's something that needs to kind of be outlined in the book, that the intersex movement by the end of the 90s had already established itself in various countries in Africa, with Julius Kagwa founding a group in Uganda, and Sally Gross, this anti-apartheid campaigner, sort of founding a group that she was then only able to join in person several years later after the fall of the regime and her eventual migration back to South Africa. So like the point I'm trying to get to is that both this has sort of become a focal point for popular understandings of intersex people, and some of the most heavily publicized struggles of seemingly intersex people have been happening around it, and as well as Africa, South Asia, and Central Asia in some cases have become cast as sort of like outside of civilization exactly. And yeah, the prospects and the involvement in public life of athletes from those countries. But yeah, so a whole bunch of South African race scientists are convinced that were convinced prior to the fall of apartheid, and maybe still are convinced that Black South Africans were especially prone to being true hermaphrodites. So to having like both like ovary testes and other setups like that. So yeah, there's especially this book Bantu Gynecology, which sort of puts this idea forward. Obviously, this is sort of like this is sort of like a consequence of the apartheid regime, because they really they want Black South Africans in sort of a single cohesive group prior to that sort of racial categorization, sort of binding together all of these different these different populations. But yeah, this was a very widespread, a very like entrenched viewpoint, which seems to just be based around like bits of statistical trickery from this one master's thesis putting forward that idea. But I think it's just one of those cases where obviously like racist regimes like the apartheid regime in South Africa come into existence, and then they get these convenient articles of fiction which very often include intersex people sort of as an output from the forms of colonial domination which they require, right?
No, thank you so much. And just on that note, I was say, because we're coming towards the time, I just want to say thanks again for coming back. Thanks for joining us. And of course, you can get listeners. I don't want to hold you up to the camera. We're not doing video. You can get Hermaphrodite Logic from all good bookstores, and of course, the one bad one from our good friends over at Verso. I always feel weird asking people if they're working on anything else, because it's just a book, and it takes bloody long to put a book together. But is there anything you're working on at the moment? Any projects coming up? Like,
I just want to say, since you were like you're brandishing your copy so nobly in front of the camera that wasn't recording, I'm really happy with the cover of this one, because it's got this like slumbering statue by the sculptor Polykeys. And in the book, I talk about different hermaphrodite statues, and not all of them have been sleeping, not all of them have been needing to awaken. So that's something that readers can also look forward to. As for your question, I'm working on 3 books right now. I really like 2 titles. So I've done transgender Marxism, I've done Hermaphrodite Logic. I'm working on like dialectics with my beloved co-thinker Alex Adamson, and that's going to be my first and only academic press book. So it's going to be with historical materialism. I'm working on a book about femininity for Pluto Press, and I have another secret project which I dare not utter the 2-word title of just yet. So there's a few things to look forward from me in the coming years, and please watch those various spaces. But for now, you should focus on Hermaphrodite Logic. And I'm very much looking forward to what your readers make of it. And I have had a delightful time discussing this one with you.
thank you so much for and also hell yeah. I mean, we're looking forward to having you on. Is the dialectics one the one that's also, I think you mentioned, is it the one that's going to work a lot along sort of Sylvia Wynter kind of narratology sort of stuff? Was he mentioned before? Was it?
Dialectics follows up on the last footnote in this entire book, which is from Alex. And actually, it follows on from the discussion we just had about female genital cutting and autopoiesis. Autopoiesis is a biological concept originally, which Sylvia Wynter draws out of the philosophy of biology. And Alex's article about her sort of both is heavily indebted to Wynter's style and approach, but also sort of takes Wynter to task for not considering some obvious points fully commensurate and supportive of her account around intersex and trans people. So if readers want a little preview, they can gladly chase up the article on Wynter, which Alex Adamson has already written. And I think like dialectics is in a way our sort of like frustrated love letter to autopoiesis. And I'm sure a lot of Acid Horizon listeners are going to love it.
Oh yes, consider yourselves both pre-invited to discuss it on the show. But Jules, thank you so much for joining us again. Folks, again, Hermaphrodite Logic out now from Verso Press. get it. It's also just very just as Jules was saying, it also just looks lovely. It has a nice like shine to it as well, which is kind of rare with verso books. You don't get shiny verso. They're usually a bit too matte and the mute. But
Yeah,
but thank you so much
it
for
gave me
listening,
exactly
folks.
the cover I asked for. Anyway, that's it. Thanks so much for having me back.
No worries at all. Okay, folks, cheers for listening, and we'll catch you next time.